Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, BNCC members and others with a keen interest of promoting trade and commercial interests between UK and Norway. On behalf of the British-Norwegian Chamber of Commerce, it is my great pleasure to introduce and welcome you all to this exciting panel discussion on the future of national cryptocurrencies. My name is Kyrre Kielland, and I am a board member of the BNCC. I'm also a partner of Reder Law Firm, which is co-hosting this event tonight. Before I introduce today's topic, I would also like to mention that the BNCC has been hosting several webinars lately, all of which are available on the website bncc.no. And I encourage all of you to go in and have a look. Tonight's event will also be displayed online on bncc.no in due course. I also mentioned that BNCC will be hosting a super interesting event next month on the topic, the future of green energy. Those of you who have registered for today's event and opted in will surely get an invite to this event. Those of you who opted out are, of course, free to get online and register directly on bncc.no. Rumor has it that registrations will open shortly and also with more information on that particular event. And without further ado, let me introduce you to the topic of today, the future of national cryptocurrencies. Is there a need? And how will they shape the business world? For those of you with interest in cryptocurrencies, the entire concept of national cryptocurrencies might seem like a complete paradox. Ever since Satoshi Nakamoto created the first Bitcoin back in 2009, to all the DeFi products we've seen lately, the idea has been that cryptocurrencies should serve as decentralized, deregulated transactional algorithms that will effectively dispose of banks and other middlemen in the transactions. The blockchain technology used in Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies typically have a combination of cryptography and a decentralized consensus-based system of nodes, which create a fully transparent and secure transaction history without the need for a central issuer such as central banks. So, Bitcoin and the other decentralized cryptocurrencies have taken a giant leap lately. From being speculative financial objects for the specially interested, it has become a central part of big corporates' financial strategies and may soon become integrated in everyday payments. This winter, Bitcoin was implemented in the financial strategy for Tesla and other major corporations. The interest in Bitcoin and other cryptocurrency is, of course, fueled by the endless rise in value compared to traditional currencies. Some say it is a bubble, others say this is the start of something even bigger. Analysts say that Bitcoin may have proven its value in real life and not just as a speculative object. And we are not here today to discuss the viability of crypto art or NFTs. The potential of digital currencies in relation to cross-border trade and payments are apparent, as well as automatization of everyday transactions through smart contracts. 2 weeks ago, the Bank of England announced an intention to explore issuing of a British central bank digital currency, so-called CBDC. And last week, Norges Bank did the same. So how will the general public and businesses adapt to these new possibilities? Can the digital currencies compete with the existing national currencies? And least, are the national banks prepared for competition? To answer all these questions and discuss the topic of today, we have invited a stellar panel who will give us each a 10 minutes keynote before we take on the panel discussion. And the first keynote out is Mr. Henry Holden, who is currently advisor at BIS Innovation for Bank of International Settlements, which is an institution owned by at least 63 central banks. Henry works at the BIS Innovation Hub, focusing on projects relating to central bank digital currency. His background is in payment and clearing systems, first at the Bank of England, and more recently in the Secretariat for the Committee on Payments and Market Infrastructures. He will open the keynotes with the definitional approach. He is going to tell us what we are talking about and what we are not talking about.
I'll do my best. Thank you very much. So thank you very much for asking me to speak. A word on the BIS, because it's a unique institution. It's an institution created by treaty, much like the IMF or the World Bank. And so the reason that I'm sort of talking definitions is because this organization in Basel, where I'm currently sort of enjoying the office space, is where the world central banks come to talk about the issues of the day, one of which is sort of cryptocurrencies or central bank digital currencies. And to do that, to have a meaningful conversation, you need to agree what you're talking about. And so sort of straight off the bat, national cryptocurrencies, the title of this talk is a bit difficult to understand. So what I'll do is I'll try and talk a little bit about how the central bank community, sort of published through sort of joint reports, has thought about cryptocurrencies, stable coins, and central bank digital currencies. And I grant you that this is a fairly new area. So what I'll try and do as well is try and illustrate my points with a couple of case studies. So first off, there's all sorts of different types of money. That's not new or unusual. But when it comes to a national cryptocurrency, I think what we're talking about is a central bank digital currency. Digital money issued by a central bank. And a central bank already issues money. You have banknotes. It's money issued by a central bank. It's a claim on a central bank. But at the same time, a central bank already has digital money. It has reserve accounts that it offers to banks and other large financial institutions. Typically sort of forms part of the high value payment system within any jurisdiction. Oh, wow, I'm getting seasick with the movement of the camera. So there's already central bank money in existence and digital money as well. But what we're talking about when we're talking about central bank digital currency is something new. So that can take one of two forms. It can take a sort of what's called a digital token, and that digital token can either be sort of for those banks that are already served by a central bank, or it can be for the general public who are already served by banknotes. What do I mean by a digital token? So in payment economics terms, when I pay somebody with an account, the validation is of me. So my bank checks that I am allowed to transfer money. But if I transfer a banknote, the bank teller will look at the banknote and check that that payment object is the thing I'm transferring. That's the kind of fundamental conceptual difference between tokens and accounts. And that potentially opens up all sorts of possibilities for digital money that weren't in existence before. Just as the introduction said, Bitcoin, you don't have to know who's on the other side. You can just transfer them, just like you can with cash. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about sort of token-based money, but for banks in the wholesale space. And so I'll talk about that before because it's a bit more niche. So why when central banks already offer money to banks and sort of for financial markets, would we be interested in doing that differently? There's a few reasons. There's foreign exchange markets and the settlement there. There's potentially new architectures of system that this makes possible. And then on security settlement, if securities, so shares and bonds, are tokenized, then there's the potential to sort of to issue tokenized money to unlock all sorts of efficiencies with sort of financial market clearing. And the Swiss Center of the BIS Innovation Hub, which I'm part of, recently ran an experiment with the Swiss National Bank and SIX, the sort of financial market infrastructure provider in Switzerland. So what the Swiss National Bank did is it sort of put money onto this distributed platform run by a SIX group. So central bank was sort of stepping outside itself and putting tokenized money into a sort of an independent financial market infrastructure. It's an interesting experiment, comes with a ton of policy implications. But at the same time, they also linked up the current existing payment system to this distributed platform and showed that they could settle that way. So it's a work in progress, honestly, when it comes to the sort of the more niche area of financial market clearing. Central banks are just exploring this and exploring some of the policy options. But onto the sort of the possibly more interesting topic for people today, when it comes to digital banknotes, sort of like a retail central bank digital currency, where you have the option of either tokenized central bank digital currency or account-based, but it honestly doesn't really matter. And so let me use another example, which is the only central bank digital currency in existence right now, based on blockchain, which is the Bahamas. So what is this thing? It's to call it a digital banknote isn't to really sort of describe it adequately. So it's a private-public partnership between the central bank, technology companies, and the financial system in the Bahamas, and it's driven by financial inclusion. So why does the Bahamas Central Bank want to issue digital money to its population? It's so they can be served by the financial system, where there are no banks, and to allow people to have access to digital payments, whereas otherwise they'd just be stuck in cash. But what does it look like? Well, to a consumer, it looks like the kind of wallet you'd have for mobile payments right now. The distribution is through payment service providers. So you don't directly interface with a central bank. You pick up a wallet, you load it with cash. It doesn't look revolutionary. But underlying that is a mix of interesting changes that sometimes get confused with the whole central bank digital currency debate. So a big driver is financial inclusion, and so therefore a big underlying factor in this is digital identity. I said earlier that digital tokens allow the possibility to transfer without any kind of identification. Well, that's great, but it's also illegal in most cases, certainly for any large transaction. And no central bank would create something that was illegal. So therefore, what you need? Well, what the Bahamas have done is they've changed the law to make sure that people have access to the know your customer data. And there are plans in train to build a know your customer utility for the islands. And you see that with a lot of big infrastructure projects, this idea of payments and this idea of identity. You see it as well in India with their stack. These are things that kind of go hand in hand, and it's quite different from cryptocurrencies and the kind of the unique selling point of cryptocurrencies, where you don't need any of that. So I'm conscious I'm droning on. So to summarize, there's all sorts of different kinds of central bank digital currency, but they're not all that exciting. The kind of fundamental conceptual difference between a central bank digital currency and a cryptocurrency is that a central bank digital currency is a claim on a central bank, and because it's issued by a central bank, it's legal, and it's issued by the government, and it's denominated in the domestic currency. So it's not one Bitcoin or some sort of floating trading thing. It's the national currency. So where you see issues around cryptocurrency use in different countries because of fears about the national currency, a central bank digital currency wouldn't fix that. It's still denominated in, for example, the Venezuelan bolivar. The central bank is still the issuing entity. And just to close off, stablecoins muddy the waters, or rather, they sort of they're a bridge between the two. So whereas a cryptocurrency sort of represents nothing but itself, so it's a free floating unit of account, a stablecoin purports to represent something, and that could be cash in an account, or it could be a derivative, it could be anything at all, and it could be central bank money in an account as well. And that's where sort of complicated definitions like synthetic central bank money come in. If I have an account at central bank and I issue stable coins off the back of it, one for one, then that's as good as a central bank digital currency, maybe, but probably not, because the point of a central bank digital currency, and sort of to go back to the Bahamas, is that it's issued by the central bank, it's issued by the government, and so the access to that central bank digital currency is neutral. It's public policy driven. It's not profit driven. And so when you think about central bank digital currencies and others, it's a big difference between the sort of profit motive and the public policy motive as well. So there's lots of different things. And when we talk about digital currencies, it can mean any of them, but they are completely different conceptually. And I'll shut up there.
Thanks a lot, Henry, for that introduction to cryptocurrencies and CBDCs, and also a little tad of stablecoins in between there. Very interesting, absolutely. And from Switzerland back to Norway, we have the next speaker from Norges Bank, Mr. Peder Østby, who is a special advisor and advises the bank on opportunities, risks, regulatory aspects of cryptocurrencies, stablecoins, CBDCs, and associated technologies. So he is going to give us an introduction to Norges Bank's CBDC project and the current status of that. So Peder, welcome.
So I should have some slides here. Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me here, and thank you for letting me talk about our CBDC project. And thanks for the introduction. I'm in a payment analysis and innovation unit in the Central Bank of Norway, where I work on digital currencies, and I'm also involved in our CBDC project. And CBDC is then Central Bank Digital Currencies. So let us just start. Why is Norges Bank looking into a retail CBDC? Because that's what we are looking into, a retail CBDC. It's a claim, an electronic claim, money available to everyone, sort of like digital cash. And why do we look into that? Before saying anything specific about that, I would like to state, since we are talking about competition here today, that the central bank is not a for-profit competitor in the money business. The central bank is a public authority pursuing some public objectives. In some countries, central banks are called monetary authorities. And those policies or public objectives we are pursuing, that is price stability, financial stability, and a secure and efficient payment system. So when we look into retail CBDC, it's because we think, or we are testing or investigating if this is a means to fulfill our mandate in the Central Bank Act. And the more kind of bigger question is if CBDC is necessary and desirable to ensure a secure and efficient payment system for Norwegian kroner in the future and trust in the Norwegian monetary system. And more precisely, we think that CBDC in Norway might be justified because it's a contingency solution. There is a low use of cash in Norway, maybe the lowest in the world. So most payments are done with bank money, and CBDC could then serve as a contingency if the banking payment system is not working for some reason. Also, CBDC could preserve and enhance competition, as cash is less of a competitor to other private money. CBDC might do that task. We also, and that's important, look into CBDC for the precautionary principle. There is a lot of development in the payment system and the monetary system right now. This is changes in the traditional infrastructure. For instance, much of the infrastructure for bank payments is moved abroad. We see cryptocurrencies, stable coins, and so on. And it might be that it's prudent for us to look into CBDC to see so we have government money that can perform those functions money should have in the future. So we don't lose gain to other platform where we lose our ability to perform our mandate. We also have some conditions on our work. We don't want CBDC to impede the private sector's role in credit intermediation. It should still be the bank and others that gives credit to the public. It's not the role of the central bank. We also don't want CBDC to impede financial stability. You could imagine that CBDC was very popular especially in a stressed situation, because it's a claim on the central bank, and that it was a run on the banks into CBDC, and that could kind of enhance this financial stability that was emerging. So we don't want that effect from CBDC. I would also like to say that introduction of CBDC in Norway is not decided. We are having a project to get better informed, but the final decision to eventually introduce CBDC will come in the future, and that will require political backing, and it might also need amendments in our Central Bank Act. So how have we worked on this project? Just briefly. As I already told, we have our mandate in the Central Bank Act, which states what we are supposed to do. And from this purpose, we have looked into, from this mandate, we have looked into the purpose of CBDC in Norway. Different countries, they have different motivations for looking into CBDC. In some countries, financial inclusion is important because more people have access to mobile phones than the banking system, for instance. That's not a big issue in Norway. In Norway, we have a situation with the declining use of cash, and we are thinking if some digital supplement should be available to replace some of those, or to complete some of those properties that cash have. And from this purpose of CBDC in Norway, we have defined a wide range of characteristics that a Norwegian CBDC should have. And from those characteristics, we have looked into technical implementations that can meet those characteristics. And we have done that. We have looked at various technical solutions. We have looked at token-based solutions. We have looked at account-based solutions. And we have done some specifications and trade-offs to see if these technical implementations can meet the characteristics. But more work is needed. So how far have we gotten? We started our work in 2016 seriously. Someone were thinking about CBDC before that, but in 2016 we established an internal working group, and it had a mandate, and we looked carefully into it. We looked into purposes, consequences, and possible technologies at a more broad and overarching level. Then, and that resulted in a report that was published in 2018. In phase 2, we looked further into the purpose of a Norwegian CBDC, given our mandate. We looked into the necessary and desirable characteristic of a Norwegian CBDC, and we looked into technical solutions. What we have done the last 2 years is that we have analyzed technical solutions further. We have validated technical solutions against the characteristics, and we have also done some more analysis. But all we have done so far is at an analytical level. We have sit at our desks and done analytical works, but now we think that it's time to get hands more dirty and do some experimental testing. So what we have also done in the phase 3, which has lasted into now, is that we have also prepared a decision basis for technical testing. And this technical testing that is likely to start this year, later this year, in phase 4. And in phase 4 we will do more analysis. There is a lot of questions to be answered. There is a lot of consequences to be looked further into. There is a lot of regulatory aspects that must be looked into closer, but we will also start experimental testing. And this experimental testing, it is to learn more. So the purpose of this experimental testing is to gain further insight into how technical solutions can meet the characteristics. Technical testing can help us to understand what other consequences on financial stability and so on that we haven't seen so far. It might reveal regulatory questions we haven't seen so far, and we will learn more. And the purpose of this experimental testing is to learn, so we don't want to test one specific technology from one specific supplier. Rather, we want to see how well different technologies can meet those characteristics we have set up. And we will also continue the stakeholder dialogue, and there might be also a political debate around this. And then our plan is to do this for up to 2 years. After 2 years, it will have to then be taken a new decisions if we should proceed with the project, if we should go further into testing a specific solution. So just briefly, I don't have the time to go through all of these characteristics we have set up for a Norwegian CBDC. But if we just go to the first, we can see that it is important that it's a claim on the central bank, because that's the essence of a CBDC, that it's a claim on the central bank and not a private entity as most electronic money today are. So since this session is in the borderline between cryptocurrencies, private digital currencies and CBDCs, a question and a teaser for the later discussion is, do we need CBDC? Maybe cryptocurrencies are up to the task. And that's an interesting question, but to approach it a little analytical, we can just start where we started. CBDC is a measure to promote the goals in the Central Banking Act if it's introduced. You don't find all these purposes in the Central Banking Act in cryptocurrencies. They have other purposes, but some have partially overlapping purposes. For instance, there are some stable coins that have the vision of being an algorithmic central bank. So there are some initiatives on how to create stable decentralized currencies. But that's only one of those objectives that we are pursuing. Also, so far, the stable coins, they are sort of have stabilization mechanisms against national currencies. So if they were to kind of replace central bank currencies, they would have to be stable independently. Also, as I said, the central bank is a public entity. It's mentioned in the Constitution. It is a Central Bank Act, and we are constitutionally responsible. Private cryptocurrencies are not responsible in the same sense to the public. And you could ask, okay, but what about regulating private currencies? Is that sufficient? This is something we look into our project. We look into alternative measures. Could we achieve the same as we want to achieve with CBDC with regulation? But it's not obvious that regulation of private money can substitute for CBDC. And I didn't have the time to go through all these characteristics, but we would see that CBDC in Norway must satisfy a range of characteristics that are not satisfied by cryptocurrencies today. An obvious characteristics is the one I mentioned, is to be a claim on the central bank. Cryptocurrencies are not that. Besides, cryptocurrencies are not denominated in Norwegian kroners, and they are not accepted for government tax payments. I think it would require a big change and a big debate if cryptocurrencies should serve this purpose. However, even if cryptocurrencies cannot fully substitute CBDC, they can serve other functions. They can exist together with CBDC, and I guess the future will show how they will exist together. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Peder, for a very interesting introduction to an update on the status with Norges Bank's project. I'm very eager to learn more about what's going to happen in this experimental phase, and I hope that this phase will prove that CBDCs do have viability and something we will see more of in the years to come. From the central banks now over to the other part of this discussion, we have invited Mr. Torbjørn Bull Jensen, who is CEO of Arcane Crypto. He is a recognized expert on Bitcoin and financial applications of blockchain technology. Arcane Crypto is a company investing in and developing services leveraging Bitcoin and other public blockchains. Torbjørn holds an MSc in economics and econometric modeling and wrote his master thesis on Bitcoin back in 2014. So he's going to tell us a bit more about Bitcoin and payment flows. So thanks, Torbjørn, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thanks for the introduction and for having me. So, when most people hear about payments and cryptocurrencies, they think either about the use of Bitcoin on darknet to buy drugs, or projects like Ripple and Stellar working with banks in consortiums, trying to use blockchain technology, or central bank money, digital currencies, or other forms of more private versions that can be used for payment. And the main focus around Bitcoin these days is as an investment, as digital gold, as something with absolute scarcity, which might be interesting in a world where the central banks are printing money faster than ever before. However, what I will talk about today is how Bitcoin can actually be a superior payment rail, not for Bitcoin-denominated transactions only, but also for fiat-denominated transactions. And the fundamental reason for that is that Bitcoin, the object, is a digital bearer asset without any counterparty risk. Unlike a CBDC, unlike bank money, it's not a claim on anybody. The value is in the object itself. And this means that you can take your local currency, you can buy Bitcoin, you can send the Bitcoin to the other side of the world and sell it, and have final settlement. This is something you cannot do with bank money. Because if I hold money in my local bank, it's a claim on that specific bank. Which means that if I'm going to send money from Norway to South Africa, there's no way that the company I'm sending money to could accept that directly, because that company does not hold an account with my bank. Instead, what we need is a chain of banks that trust each other in bilateral relations and can exchange debt or claims on each other through what is called the correspondent banking system. And this is an extremely slow and expensive process. And many think the main reason for this slowness and the cost is the the fact that there's too many mainframes, the technology is too outdated. But even with a completely modern technology, you would still have the same underlying issue, which is that as long as the money form you have is in the form of a claim is inseparably linked to a jurisdiction, which means that when you're transferring money internationally and you're crossing jurisdictions, it becomes really difficult. And we also see this when it comes to geopolitics, where, for instance, the EU and US for a period was, let's say, not in agreement in how to treat Iran, where Trump left the nuclear agreement and reinstated sanctions against Iran, but where the EU wanted to continue to have business with Iran, but were unable to do so because of the traditional payment system being centralized. So by just using Bitcoin as the payment rail, exchange into Bitcoin, leverage the fact that there is always a market for Bitcoin all over the world. Bitcoin is traded 24/7, 365 days a year, which means that even if it's a Sunday, you can get settlement, you have a price, and you just use the Bitcoin as a payment rail, not the denomination for the transaction. So this can give faster and cheaper payments. But it also brings an additional really nice feature, which is interoperability. If you look at the fintech apps today, they are built up as closed networks, which means that if you are spending from PayPal, the merchant you're sending money to also have to have an account with PayPal. It means that there's no way for me as a Norwegian to send money from Vipps to an American friend using Cash App, or to someone using Venmo or Revolut for that matter. This is in very stark contrast to how we are used to have digital services, especially on the internet, where you can use whatever browser you'd like and still browse the same web as others, where you can use whatever email client you'd like. I can use Proton Mail, someone else can use Safari, someone can use Outlook, but we can all send emails to each other without thinking about what service provider the receiver is using, because email is an open, interoperable protocol. By going via Bitcoin as the payment rail, we can get that layer of interoperability for payments as well. Cash App in the US actually have native support for Bitcoin transactions, meaning that if I'm using a Norwegian exchange to buy Bitcoin, I can easily send that to my friend in the US. And we're now approaching a future where the exchange in and out between cryptocurrency, in particular Bitcoin, and fiat currency can happen in the back end. More and more companies like Arcane are building services leveraging Bitcoin in this exact way, but removing the complexity from the companies and the users using these type of setups. So this is really what caught my interest when I wrote my master thesis on Bitcoin back in 2014. The problem back then, of course, was that it costed around 10% or more to exchange from fiat currency into Bitcoin, and then it costed the same to exchange out again. And on top of that, the Bitcoin blockchain could at maximum handle up to 7 transactions per second. It didn't scale. But both of those challenges are being solved right now. On the scaling front, the Lightning Network, an overlay technology atop of Bitcoin, is currently enabling instantaneous Bitcoin transactions without any extra energy consumption, without any slow block times, and without the high fees of using the blockchain. In parallel, the market has matured massively since 2014. In 2014 or 2013, during that hype when Bitcoin reached an astonishing price of $1,000 a unit, there was one exchange globally called Mt. Gox serving around 70% of the trading volume in the world. And that exchange was spectacularly hacked or an inside job. Nobody really knows. Now, however, there's hundreds and hundreds of exchanges all over the world, regulated exchanges provided by traditional players from the traditional finance space, and you can exchange in and out, and the cost is not 10% anymore. We're talking about basis points. So now we can have really efficient exchange in and out. You can have it any day of the week, any week of the year, doesn't matter if it's Christmas Eve. And combining that with a scaling ability with Lightning, we are now finally unlocking the payment use case for Bitcoin. So this is my hypothesis that this is the next frontier that is going a little bit under the radar right now when people are primarily focused on the trading case. But this can be truly transformational, and especially in a multipolar world where not all parts of the world are equally eager to cooperate. And then, of course, a major topic for this panel is central bank digital currency. And my question that I would like to kind of look at and put out some of my thinking on is whether central bank digital currency even can compete with Bitcoin. Because if you look at it, it looks unlikely. When you listen to the central bank, to the biz, it's very clear that central bank digital currency is raising a ton of questions. Who should decide on the development? What should the criteria and goals be? What technologies should be used? Who should have access? Should every citizen? What if they are criminal? What if they are underage? What about citizens in other countries? Or what about the citizens in one country? Should they be allowed to use the CBDC of another country? How will CBDCs impact the private banks and the credit creation? Should there be an interest rate on holding a CBDC? And if so, should it be possible that that interest rate could be negative? Should it be a tool for perfect surveillance or for privacy? All of these questions are really, really hard. And all of these central bank projects are trying to deal with this by having some workshop, some working group, some committee discussing it. And while they're discussing and the years are flying by, Bitcoin really don't care. Bitcoin is amongst crypto people called the honey badger of money, because the honey badger is really badass. It's just doing whatever it wants. It's eating poisonous snakes. It's it kind of doesn't take shit from anybody. It just does its thing without really asking for permission, which gives speed and innovation. And the fact that Bitcoin doesn't have a committee is what allows Bitcoin to really grow as an organic system. But the interesting thing here is then, of course, why did Bitcoin come about? There was never some authority that said, let's do Bitcoin for this reason. It just emerged. It kind of grew out from an email list, an 8-page document. And the reason why it grew out and the reason why it became so big is because there were this underlying demand. There are a lot of transactions that are not finding place without Bitcoin in the world. There are a lot of frictions stopping people from doing interactions, economic interactions they would like to do. There might be good reasons for those frictions. It might be transactions that we genuinely want to limit, but there might also be transactions that should have found kind of its form. And this was identified by Milton Friedman, a Nobel-winning economist in 1999, when he really realized the tremendous power of the internet, how internet decentralized the flow of information, but where he also realized that the one thing that was missing, but that he was pretty certain would soon be developed, was a reliable e-cash. A method whereby person A could transfer money to person B online without A knowing B or B knowing A, without there being any necessarily trace or kind of identification needing to happen, the same way you can do with a $20 bill. And then 9 years later, Bitcoin did emerge. And it's this emergence that is really key here. Bitcoin was never a plan. It was never a decision, let's create Bitcoin, this is how we do it, here's a committee, we've come up with an optimal design, let's execute on this design. It's a product of evolution. New people, new types of groups are coming in, using it in the way they want, adding in the code, software, applications in the way they want. And evolution is something that gives us something beautiful like a wolf, where intelligent design gives us something like a mops. And there's actually a law regulating this, of course not a real law, but a rule of thumb law called Gall's law. So Gall is the king of complex systems, and he stated that any complex system or a complex system that works is inevitably found to have evolved from a simple system that worked. And that a complex system designed from scratch never works. You cannot design a complex system top down and get it to work. You have to scrap it and have to start over and start with something simple. And still, people try over and over and over again to design top-down, use a committee to design something really complex. And there's a real risk that the central bank digital currencies will end up as too complex. It's not given, but if they do, they will fail. And we've seen this before. When the internet emerged, there was something called the OSC standard. All the governments, or most of the governments around the world, coordinated through the ISO standardization organization, came up with the OSC standard that should regulate how digital communication should be used. In Norway, it was actually put into law in 1991 that any public procurement of a digital system should follow the OSC standard. However, the TCP/IP standard, an open standard without this type of backing, was the one that won the territory. And luckily for Norway, the laws that said that we should had to follow the OSC standard was never really followed. So the OSC standard died despite all the backing. The R3 consortium, all the biggest banks kind of joined forces to get the power of blockchain without the problems of cryptocurrencies, failed. Libra, building this consortium that should revolutionize payments, it was Facebook backing it. This would be huge. Nothing. And as I say, there's a real risk that central banks replicate this if they try out to build something too complex from the get-go. And I just want to round off with some wise words from Friedrich Hayek, who pointed out that the curious task of economics is to demonstrate to men, or perhaps central bankers, how little they really know about what they imagine they can design. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Torbjørn, for that introduction to this topic from the Bitcoin side. And obviously, I understand that we will probably have some discussion on the agility of the Bitcoin technology versus the regulations and difficulties of the CBDCs afterwards. Our next speaker is our London correspondent, so to speak, Mr. Martin Sandbø of the Financial Times. He is the European economics commentator for Financial Times. Also writes Free Lunch, the weekly newsletter of FT on the global economic policy debate. Before joining Financial Times, he worked in academia and policy consulting. He has taught and carried out research at Harvard, Columbia, and the Wharton School, and has advised governments and NGOs on natural resources and economic development. He's also the author of 3 books, including The Economics of Belonging. So Mr. Martin Sandbø will tell us a bit more about the comparative perspective and give us a broader political and public perspective to the topic. So go ahead, Martin. I hope you can hear us.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me.
We can. Thank you.
Thanks for inviting me to the panel. I come at this from a sort of economic policy and political observer angle. And in my introductory remarks, I want to try to convince you that central banks should adopt CBDCs, that they will adopt CBDCs faster than we think, and that once they do, the prospect for cryptocurrencies will very quickly wither away. So I think it's about as diametrically opposite from the previous presentation as we can get. So I think we'll have a good discussion. I just want to first point out just a factual observation that central banks were perhaps a little bit late to this game, but they've been upping their game and speeding up their research quite impressively. You will remember when Facebook made a splash with its Libra proposal a couple of years ago, which really galvanized central banks and finance ministries into action. And since then, things have really been happening very, very, very fast. Central banks aren't, it's true, they all have committees thinking about this, but they are actually moving a little bit further than that now. The ECB has already had a public consultation That has been closed, it has been commented on, it has been analyzed, and they are ready, I think, to move to the next step of starting to experiment. Of course, other central banks have done technical experiments. The Swedes have. The Bank of England has opened a public consultation. So this is already now being taken to the public as something that goes outside of the kind of geek circles that we all belong to. But I think there's sort of two big parts, two big aspects to how this looks to a policymaker. There's a defensive aspect and there's an offensive or aggressive aspect. The defensive aspect, I think, is very well illustrated by the Libra episode. When Facebook published that paper, everybody freaked out. They really had done very bad communication management. Everybody freaked out, but they freaked out for very good reason. They envisaged, well, suppose that a lot of monetary transactions in our economy start being carried out in the form of this thing, this stable coin that Facebook is proposing. What are the risks? Again, I'm speaking here from a policymaker's perspective. Well, the risks are really glaring. There's the obvious one of simple safety. Will the transactions actually be carried out? You know, you think you pay, will the payment actually be received at the other end? Well, if that's done by a private company, you'd better be sure that the private company can do that. There's the risk of criminality and fraud and so on. The first one was technical risk, but there's the risk of criminality. What will go on with these stable coins? Will this be a way for people to engage in illicit activities, cheat on their taxes, do accounting fraud? Will this be the new, what used to be anonymous Swiss bank accounts that have been largely got rid of? And the third risk is by far bigger than the other two. And it is, suppose that most of our people actually start sort of living their economic lives in Libra or Bitcoin or some other coin that isn't kroner or pound sterling. Well, that really changes and diminishes a central bank's ability to control monetary policy, because ultimately monetary policy is controlled by setting rates on central bank money and therefore on money as it exists in the banking system, also through regulation of the banking system. And ultimately you affect the economy as a central bank by regulating how much money is circulating. Imperfectly, with difficulty, but that's how it works. If the money that's being used isn't the money that you control, you no longer have a monetary policy. The supply of Bitcoin is set by a formula. That's part of the attraction for some of those who use it. It's very predictable how many Bitcoin will be in existence. I think it's perfectly predictable, except for these sort of technical problems of forking and things being locked up and so on. But that's no good for monetary policy. There's no good monetary policy that involves that exact path of the money supply that Bitcoin sets. So for a central banker and for a finance minister, it would be, and for an economy, it would be terrible if the money people use in the aggregate, the majority of it is not the fiat money of the central bank of the jurisdiction. Now, add to that the risk that the new electronic money that people use isn't run by Facebook, which is bad enough, but some other country's government or central bank. You can sort of add on the geopolitical risk to the ones that we already had. So all of these reasons, this all sort of stared in the face of policymakers. They couldn't avoid that question once the Libra paper came out. And that, I think, is the main reason why they've suddenly speeded up. They've said, well, what can we do? What do we need to do to avoid this? How dangerous is it? What are the alternatives? That's happening everywhere. And then there are some offensive, if you like, forward-looking opportunities. I mean, if there is a use case here, isn't it one that central banks can provide? Apart from just being defensive and say, well, we can't have others do it. What is the positive case? And here there are a couple. It depends a bit whether you're a small or a big country. For a small country, it's a real risk that people start adopting another country's electronic currency once they start to come about. So I think that's important for a country like Norway. For the Eurozone, probably less so. The bigger risk is a private company. But there might be some opportunities to try to get others to use their currency. So inside the ECB, for example, there is research that they lean on and take seriously that suggests that in terms of policy, there's a first mover advantage. If you have two big jurisdictions two big independent monetary systems. Think the Eurozone and the US, the Eurozone and China. One of them has a central bank digital currency and the other doesn't. There are some monetary policy advantages where the one that has a digital currency gets more room for maneuver, more freedom of maneuver, and the other one correspondingly becomes a bit more dependent on developments in the first mover jurisdiction. Now, whether this is true, whether this is theory, but it's informative theory. I think there's another first mover advantage if you think about where the biggest use case for electronic currencies is, which is cross-border transactions between smaller and often poorer jurisdictions, where it's very hard and very expensive to send money. The sort of thing that we just heard about Bitcoin can actually solve quite well. Remittances, people, migrant workers in rich countries sending money back to poorer countries. It's extremely expensive, and there's good policy reasons to fix that. But there are also a lot of currency transactions that take place in trade between countries that don't belong to any of the big blocs. And there's a market for the taking there. At the moment, most of that is done in US dollars. I think it's a fair bet that part of the thinking around China's Belt and Road Initiative is also to try to make people invoice more in renminbi. I think the digital renminbi is partly intended to make that easier. And you could think about the Eurozone, where there is an explicit policy goal to increase the international use of the euro. That one reason for a CBDC euro, an e-euro, is to try to encourage the use of euro invoicing and euro transaction between trading partners in two different third countries. That's a second sort of offensive aim that a big jurisdiction could hope for. The third one is domestic industrial policy. You know, when you have cash, you will have somebody invent a cash register. You know, if you never knew what cash was, nobody would invent a cash register. The cash registers of the future are, of course, much more sophisticated, and they are fintech. They are things like smart contracts, self-executing contracts. That will happen when money is easily programmable. So there's an argument to be made. Again, this is quite speculative, but to me it seems sensible to think that the first rich major jurisdiction that introduces a programmable official e-money, a programmable CBDC, will get an advantage over other places as an ecosystem for developing whatever fintech we can imagine around smart contracts and programmable money. So there are a lot of defensive reasons, and there are some offensive reasons why the case for a CBDC is really very, very strong. And that's why I think we've seen this work speed up. It's why I think it's a matter of time and not very much time before major countries adopt one. I think we'll see it in, well, we're seeing trials, local trials in China already. I think we'll see it nationwide probably next year. Some say that they want to get it in place before the Olympics. In fact, China seems to see an advantage in not letting the payment system be captured by these private companies that do very, very well, and financial and so on. And so very soon, I think in the Eurozone, it could be 3 or 4 years from now. Perhaps Sweden will opt for it by then. They were a pioneer. They have slowed down a bit. But I think they are coming. They're coming faster than we think. Once they're in place, I'll stop here. I've used up my time, but I will kind of put out as a claim and we can discuss it. Once they're in place, there will be a very poor use case for things like Bitcoin, other cryptocurrencies, except for the sort of illicit, illegal activities that authorities will in any case want to crack down on. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Martin, for that geopolitical and economic analysis. And we are about to go over in the discussion phase, and you will continue from your online office as well as Henry. But before we open the panel, I just want to ask you one question, Martin. You mentioned the first mover advantage, but would you see any first mover disadvantages as well? I mean, Peder talked about the risks, etc., involved with national digital currencies. Some nations might be very happy with the current situation with the fiat money. The US has been a global currency for decades. So would you see any disadvantages of being the first one out?
Well, I think the disadvantages are mainly in being the one to make the mistakes that others learn from, which would be a public service, but of course bad, given that things possibly could go very badly wrong, which is why everyone is so cautious and doing pilots and so on. But I don't see that as a big first mover disadvantage. I don't see any sort of big systemic effect of that. I don't think anyone will jump into an untested system that allows for the complete meltdown of their financial system, in which case others will also be affected. So I think they're minor. You know, it could be that you get, you know, you basically get an embarrassing launch of something that ends up working, people realizing they can't pay their bills and the government ending up falling because of it, that sort of thing, right? I can see that as a sort of downside risk, but no, not really.
Thanks, Martin, and we will get back to you very shortly. And as I already mentioned, we have you online and we have Henry online, and in studio here we have Torbjørn and Peder. Torbjørn, you're right next to me, so maybe the first question goes for you. I would like to start with the first topic today, and that is, can the digital currencies, including Bitcoin, can they compete with the existing currencies and the payment systems as it is?
So I think for foreseeable future is unlikely to compete as unit of account with the largest and most popular fiat currencies. As a payment rail and a completely new infrastructure, I definitely think it can and will compete. It already competes in certain payment corridors, remittances increasingly being routed via Bitcoin. But we also see now more and more companies bridging the traditional financial world with Bitcoin, using open banking, using APIs and connecting that to Bitcoin over Lightning so that you can spend Bitcoin straight from your bank account and the company you're paying to can receive those Bitcoin to their bank account. And with these types of solutions emerging, you start to see use from users who don't really care about it being Bitcoin. They care about it being faster, cheaper, and simpler.
So you think that sometime in the future, Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies will be preferred means of payment for a cup of coffee or a cross-border transaction?
So not denomination, but as in the infrastructure. So if you look at the internet, before internet, we had TV, of course, with a separate kind of network for TV. We had radio, we had newspapers. But internet turned out to be a general information network. And as the internet scaled and grew, although it was not tailored to any of those use cases, today we see almost every phone call being routed via internet as the infrastructure. We see almost every TV sending being routed via internet as the infrastructure. And it's not unlikely that we might see a similar type of development for monetary transactions being routed via Bitcoin as the payment rail. That doesn't mean that it's unregulated. You'll still have the entities at the endpoints being centralized in most cases, being fully regulatable, requiring KYC, all the same checks. And in fact, you can actually end up having more transparency than what you have today. To most participants, even financial regulators, the correspondent banking system is a black box until the money pops out on the other side. It's really hard to actually trace it through that, and very few who can. Whereas with Bitcoin, you can easily trace it from the local service provider you had, no intermediaries, and the exit point.
That's very interesting. And Henry, you're with us from Switzerland. Working with the Bank of International Settlements, I would assume that you know a little bit about the current payment infrastructures out there. And are you agreeable to Torbjørn's views here? Is the current payment infrastructures, will that allow for such development and use of Bitcoin?
So the easy answer is yes. I mean, you know, it's quite easy to kick the correspondent banking system. It's pretty rubbish, but also it's a bit unfair to sort of characterize it as sort of universally rubbish, and this sort of straw man of something that's that hasn't improved a huge amount recently. It's something that was sort of mentioned in a lot of the kind of opening comments. It's sort of it actually depends who you are when it comes to making a cross-border payment. For some people, it's very, very easy and very quick and very cheap. And for other people, if they can do it at all, because it's very difficult, it's very expensive, and it's very slow. And that has a lot to do with sort of two inherent issues. One is foreign exchange, and the other is sort of the anti-money laundering, sort of know your customer compliance rules. And you can't get around those. One is, well, actually, you can't get around them, but you can circumvent them. So, if you wanted to circumvent the need for FX, well, then you could use a Libra coin, and then you could just pass all the risk back onto the final user. I don't think anybody would disagree with me on that. The other one is following the law, and that depends on the function. I suppose I do agree with a lot of what's been said, maybe even though I'm not supposed to. But I think that the fundamental thing is these are not it's not incoherent to say that a central bank digital currency is a good thing, and an improved correspondent banking system is a good thing, and a Bitcoin payment rail used by payment service providers who have all their KYC and AML checks done is a good thing, and these cannot coexist. On the contrary, it would be a very positive thing if we had a very efficient system driving improvements in the other one. A few years ago at the a committee level, when we started to talk about this, it was an FT journalist who asked my boss, Benoit Couret, you can make transfers in Bitcoin cheaper than you can using the traditional systems, and his reply was, that's bad, because that just shows the traditional systems really need to be fixed. And so there's a very positive case to to catalyze improvements. And then moving to the domestic level, Bitcoin looks like commodity money. It as a unit of account, it's not safe. It's not really functional. So will it take over? No. Is it safe to use? No. But I don't disagree with what's being said about trying new things. And as long as you follow the law, it's a really positive innovation.
I agree. But Peder, would you agree to this? I mean, you talked about the risks on the domestic level, especially. I think it's not possible to pay my taxes in Bitcoin. You said that. So, would you agree with Torbjørn and partially also Henry that Bitcoin serves in the future will serve as means of payments for most transactions, or would you disagree?
Well, it's very difficult to make such a prediction now, but I don't think so in the near future. And I think that Torbjørn was into something very important, which is the unit of account. The unit of account is one part of national currencies, and it's hard to change. And it's not only hard to change because it's a shifting cost, but the unit of account is protected by law in many senses. So, for instance, taxes are paid in units of accounts and so on. So for domestic payments, I think it takes time to change that. You can have kind of other units of accounts in some communities. For instance, if you trade with Bitcoin, you want to compare with other cryptocurrency prices with Bitcoin rather than dollar, for instance, because you're trading on some altcoin cycles and things like that. But and you might see that for kind of cross-border trades, then maybe some other stable coins, for instance, who can provide some basket of currencies could function as a unit of account. And when it comes to another part of a payment, it's the payment system itself. And kind of for retail payment, most of the payments today are done in private money. It's done with bank money, and not so much use of cash anymore, at least in Norway. So we sort of already have payments there, and then if you want to use Bitcoin or some other unit of account, it would be some, switching or some cognitive costs. So, but it might be used. But I think that what is often ignored, that kind of at least lawyers are often concerned with, is that the ultimate kind of settlement in the national unit of account has to be done in central bank money, at least for some regulatory purposes. So if you want to do these systemic settlements in something else than central bank money, you need some changes in regulations. So regulations might change and things, but I think it's a way to go. But I don't preclude that for some cross-border payments that are not systemically important and things then Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies might have a role, and they might improve efficiencies in some sense.
But more the systemical settlements, you wouldn't leave that to an algorithm within the first couple of years, I guess.
Well, what I would do, I don't know, but I think that there are regulations in place, and they are there for a reason. So you must at least ensure that the financial market infrastructures and so on that settles things, that they are safe and secure. And today this is considered to be settlement in central bank money.
Yeah.
Could I raise a question or a point? Because very often when people talk about central bank digital currency, and especially Martin here, says that if that is successful, there will be no use for Bitcoin. And I definitely think that both will and can coexist. What is a more open question to me is what the hell will happen to the bank money we have today, which is completely dominant for payments today. And I think that central bank digital currency, it's much more of a threat to the private banks and the monopoly position they have today in facilitating digital payments. So I would be very curious to hear, I'm sorry, I'm not intending to take your role here, but hear some of your thoughts on how, Martin, how you see private bank money kind of thriving or suffering in a CBDC world.
Yes, Martin.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I raised my hand when you started talking, so I hope that I would be given the floor. No, because you're quite right. Let me first completely disagree with your first point and completely agree with the second to simplify it a bit. It's exactly the right questions to ask, right? What would a world with CBDCs do to cryptocurrencies, and what would it do to the money, the preponderant form of money we have today, which are private bank deposit claims on private entities we call banks? Just to do the first one first, the reason why I think that the use case for cryptocurrencies will largely disappear is this. The strongest use case is cross-border payments. And many of the advantages that you pointed out, I think are advantages of a blockchain structure, not necessarily Bitcoin per se. Of course, a CBDC could be done over blockchain. I mean, those are sort of technical questions, energy questions, functionality questions. But how would it look like from the user's perspective? So suppose you want to buy something in the US from Oslo. In the Bitcoin world, as I understand it, and I assume a world where we are still, within a country, we're still using the fiat money, largely. So in Norway, we use kroner, in the US, we use dollars, but for international transactions, Bitcoin obviously much better than either paying big fees to Visa or transfer money through bank accounts. So the way it looks, what makes it convenient is that you convert your kroner into Bitcoin. You can immediately, without intermediaries, see that the Bitcoin arrives in the New York-based vendor's account, and that vendor can then convert the Bitcoin into dollars. So just 2 steps. Much better than today with correspondent banking, I agree. But of course, if you had CBDCs, and presuming that they remain convertible, right? Then it would just be 1 step, right? You would just go from it could be a central bank held account, it could be a token, whatever the technical solution is. You would simply pay and then pay the exchange rate on the way straight into the vendor's account. There would be 1 step. So on that account, it would actually be simpler. So I just don't see why ordinary people, at least, would want to go for something more exotic than just a new digital form of the money they have. Private bank money, normal deposit bank money, is very different. I think that would probably change enormously. I mean, there are two kind of worries here, or possibilities. One is that it's just very convenient to use CBDC, so that's what people use. So they stop using deposit money for transactions. Then there's the other one that central bankers lose their sleep about at night, which is you might have lots of people use deposit money, but then they get nervous and there's a run on the banks and everyone goes into central bank money. Those are two different kinds of problems, but they're both, I think, real challenges. But I actually think that we shouldn't be so scared of either of those. For the first one, it's kind of bizarre that we use the same claim on private entities, both as a way to store money in a very liquid form and as a way of carrying out transactions, and to some extent as a way to invest. It's not rational to fulfill all those functions with the same means, let alone with a means that's provided by, a private company. That's the reason why we keep getting into banking crisis and why we have to regulate them so much. I actually think it would be a good thing if ordinary transactions were done in central bank money. I think electronic cash is safer from a systemic perspective and from a retail perspective than bank deposit money. And then banks could offer, they could offer maturity transformation, they could offer some interest rates. If you leave your money with them for a while, it would look more like an investment. The stability point is tougher. But of course, central banks already play this function of supporting the banking system when there are runs. How do they do that? They do that by issuing central bank money in return for collateral. They do that for individual banks. If there's a run on a bank, they will say, well, you give me all the mortgages you have, you get 70 cents on the dollar, and then you pay your withdrawals with that. Or if you collapse, then we have a deposit guarantee fund. That's the sort of thing that can be transferred into a more predominant CBDC world too. And Mervyn King, I think, is very good on this. He wrote a book after he left the Bank of England, where he proposed this idea that he called a pawnbroker for all seasons. He thinks central banks should be pawnbrokers for all seasons, by which he meant that ex ante, as a condition for being a normal bank, you need to pawn all your assets with the central bank, i.e. you have to say, this is what I have. The central bank says, okay, this is how much you would get for this as collateral if you had to get it. And then you're not allowed to have more deposits than what you can get with your collateral. If you had that, then even a run on the entire banking system is perfectly manageable in liquidity terms. So I think there are solutions to this. And on the whole, if this means that the banking system, as we know it, becomes less prominent, I think that's a very good thing, because the private banking system keeps getting us into trouble. It's not a good way to run a modern economy. And certainly continental Europe is hugely overbanked, has too much bank debt, too little equity. So if CBDC leads to a decline of the banking system, a significant decline of the private banking system, to me, that's a bonus. Because every central banker in the world will say the opposite, because banks are their constituents too. But not having to be in that position, I can afford to say that I think that would actually be a good thing, not a bad thing.
Yeah, and we also got some questions in from the audience, but before and one for you, Martin. But before that, I want perhaps Henry, if you would respond to the comment from Martin just now. Are the central banks up for this? May we now expect the CBDCs to be issued on equal or better infrastructure than the private digital currencies or the existing fiat currencies? And what would be the advantages of CBDCs in this respect?
Well, I mean, on what Martin said, I agree. So the Riksbank just published some research that bears out exactly what he said about sort of accepting wider collateral, being able to manage sort of liquidity spikes. It seems manageable there's obviously a lot of work going on in the background on, on disintermediating banks. So we published a report in October. We, the BIS, and 7 other the sort of the largest central banks in the world. And it was sort of very sort of high level principles for how we'd sort of manage this. And that work's ongoing. But I also, when you talk about the what will central bank digital currencies look like, and sort of what the infrastructure will look like, I go back to Torbjørn's point earlier about designing systems that are terrifyingly complicated by committee, and that is a serious concern among central banks, that we don't fall into that trap, and you don't launch a white elephant that will be that won't have any adoption because it'll be out of date before you actually issue the thing. But that's not that's not the policy goal, and that's not the strategy either. The strategy is to have a sort of a piece of infrastructure that private entities, whether they're banks or whether they're payment service providers or whoever, can build on top of. It's exactly a continuation of what we have now. We have a sort of a private-public partnership between central banks who allow banks access to reserve accounts and then issue the money. But somewhat different because there isn't the credit. So again, harking back to what Martin said. So it's same principle, different implementation. And that means you don't have to do the sort of the complicated stuff. You create conditions for private players to engage in that competition, to engage in that diversity, and then serve different markets as well. But using one currency that is safe. So the infrastructure is a technical issue. Yes, you actually have to build some computer boxes, but it's also a legal infrastructure. You have laws and regulations that protect people, and it's conceptual and economic. You have a currency issued by a central bank that knows what it's doing, that has a certain amount of independence, with price stability as its mandate, etc., etc. So infrastructure is multi-layered and with many different aspects.
And Peder, perhaps you would comment on that. I mean, Bahamas already has its sand dollar. When can we have the salmon krone? Is that is Norges Bank holding too much back here and too afraid of the risks and all the complicatedness of issuing a CBDC?
Well, I have told about how far we are in the process. We have followed this quite closely for some years now. You can always second guess kind of how much resources should we put into this, but we have at least followed it to the extent that we have followed the evolution, and we are up to date with the technologies, and we are ready for experimental testing. So I don't think we are lagging behind, but it's not up to me to say when it will be introduced. But I can say that we want to be ready so that we have something to recommend if it is to be introduced. And now we will do experimental testing. The plan is to do that for up to 2 years. And then we will be prepared to recommend if it should be introduced and what technical solution that should be tested further. But it's up to the politicians and to decide if it should be introduced or not, and when.
Absolutely. Would you comment on that?
Yeah, because this kind of the definition of when is it a CBDC is really, really interesting here. Because in China already, Alipay and WeChat Pay, the very dominant fintech payment apps, are already required to hold 100% reserve with the central bank. So they're already settling with the central bank. Their end users are holding a claim on these entities. But if that is the model you're going after, where you have private PSPs, payment service providers, operating, getting access to settlement directly in the central bank, that is something that's actually in place in China already. And there's been a couple of years since I've read up on this, on the development with the European Central Bank, but to the best of my understanding was also something that the ECB was pretty far coming in terms of potentially opening up its balance sheet to PSPs and to use that directly. So I think what's really fascinating with this is like it touches on the narrow bank discussion. Should banks have full reserves for the payment instruments? It touches on the geopolitical aspect, and there I think it'll be super fascinating to see what China does. I'm not a politician, no, the political scientist, but my hunch would be that China is one of the few big countries that would be willing to potentially issue a tokenized CBDC they would let people use outside of China without requiring KYC and without reversing it potentially. I don't see that coming from either the ECB or especially not kind of like the Norwegian Central Bank. They would not, to the best of my guessing, allow for a Norwegian kroner that would be kind of freely usable by people internationally. China, on an offense, on the other hand, annoyed with the really kind of long and strong position the dollar has had and the privilege that has given the US, might potentially be willing to push for that. Because if you require all of those kind of checks from the point of issuance, it really hinders the use between, say, two African countries and companies in those countries to use it as a settlement layer if they have to do KYC with some Chinese entity. Yeah.
I agree. And Martin, there's a question for you from the audience. Do you see CBDCs actually being able to implement the programmable aspects? This seems to me to be much better done by this faster iterating private sector.
I mean, I think that's right in terms of where will you find the technological innovation. I mean, let's distinguish between two things. One is programmability, and the other is the programming, the algorithms, and so on. I mean, what I had in mind was an infrastructure, a sort of base layer for how the CBDC works, how the claim on a CBDC transfers from one person to another or one entity to another, but where that infrastructure is made technologically in a way that automated instructions, self-exchanging contracts, and so on can plug into that. Think of an operating system and apps, right? So what I think the advantage would lie in is in a jurisdiction central bank creating or adopting a technology. They won't be the ones creating it, but specifying and adopting a technology that makes it straightforward for fintech entrepreneurs to say, well, nobody's thought of a service that does, X, Y, Z, right? Automatic savings, or the model here is, when your bank app in the US, for example, allows you to add a little bit to your savings account, add the change to your savings account whenever you spend something, that sort of thing. Whatever the instruction is, it could be something super sophisticated that we can't imagine now. That will be done by private innovators. The key is to have the infrastructure in place where private innovators can play around with ideas and come up with this.
Yeah, I agree.
So I don't want to come across as being negative about the private sector and the innovation that's going to happen there. That's where almost all the innovation will happen, and it's where the technology for CBDC will come from. I've basically been trying to talk about the product spec that the central banks have to come up with.
Yeah. And very briefly, Peder, because we're running out of time, but you can have one comment on that.
Yeah, I would just like to say that we have considered this programmability analytically and carefully, and have done some considerations, and it raises many issues. And when it comes to a CBDC, if the register has full programmability, that raises many concerns. For instance, should we have NFTs on our CBDC registers, maybe wrap Bitcoin? I don't think that's within our mandate, but I think that at least some standardization and programmability can be useful to make CBDC compatible with other platforms where you can benefit from other programmability functionalities.
Agreed. And this will be the final question for all the 4 panelists. 5 years from now, will my international client prefer to pay my obviously not so excessive lawyer bills in fiat currency wire transfers, or with the Bitcoin or other private cryptocurrencies, or with a CBDC? We could start with Henry.
I'm going to dodge the question by saying they'll want to do it quickly and cheaply and conveniently. So, and to do that, they'll need a choice. So whatever they use, it will be. Sorry, the air conditioning's just gone in here. So it will. So whatever they use, it will. As long as it's legal, the more the better, basically.
Martin, do you have what's your best guess?
Yeah, 5 years, you're kind of choosing a tricky timeline there because it's a little bit short, but let me stick my neck out and say CBDCs, but with the caveat that it could be something that looks very much like what Torbjörn said. It could be basically an account in a private bank that is 100% by regulation, a special account 100% backed by central bank reserves and presumably segregated, that you need to have a little bit more so that it's really 100% as safe as central bank money, but it could look like that. So given the variety of things that CBDC could be, I think, yes, it would be CBDC.
Okay.
Maybe give it 7 years.
What do you think, Peder?
Well, I think that as a lawyer, you're subject to quite strict KYC requirements, so at least it must comply with that. But also as a law firm, you are equipped with the ability to handle the legal, regulatory and tax issue associated with accepting different currencies. So I think you would kind of be in a position to accept whatever the client wants to pay with. And I think that the client will want to pay with basically the currency he has or she has his income. And that might for many, and maybe especially for you, if you have cryptocurrency industry clients, they might want to pay with some stable coins or bitcoins or something. But I still think within 5 years, most conventional clients will still want to pay with Norwegian kroners and with wire transfers. But I think you will be equipped to handle different payments. And I think that just as a kind of anecdote, I think that a kind of more fundamental issues is that if your clients win a non-contract damage suit in a Norwegian court, what currency would the court nominate the damages in? And that would by law be Norwegian kroners. And I don't think that will change in 5 years.
How about you, Torbjörn? What do you think?
So I clearly think that different monies intermediate different relations. And I just want to use this opportunity to also raise, many people when they talk about the history of money think of it as a timeline, commodity money, bank money, credit card money. Where the way I view it is that it depends on the type of social relation you have. I think you'll use Norwegian kroner, the same banking system actually, within Norway. I think if you're in shipping, if you're dealing with countries and payment corridors where it's really difficult and expensive today, it might very well be Bitcoin. We are already paying several freelancers in Bitcoin, and that's on their request. I don't think it'll be CBDC.
Okay. I would have guessed Bitcoin from you as the answer. Well, I think that's the final question we have the time for, and I would like to thank all the 4 of you, especially Henry from Switzerland and Martin from England, and of course also my Norwegian friends here, Peder and Torbjörn. I would also like to thank all of you watching from home offices or your offices. I hope you got some input on this kind of a major topic, and I also hope that we at the BNCC were able to give you a good start on the evening from this discussion. So with that, I will conclude, and thanks again for watching.
Thank you very much.